The Declaration is a response to the influence that the notion of rights based on gender identity has in the human rights arena. The Declaration argues that gender identity rights are in conflict with the human rights of women. Those who campaign for them demand that men who claim to have a female gender identity should be included in the category of women. The Declaration argues that this is a form of discrimination against women. It's important to think internationally when dealing with the threat posed by men's cross-dressing activism, commonly called the transgender rights movement, to women's human rights. There is a considerable and growing feminist resistance to this aspect of men's rights activism in individual countries. But the transgender rights movement is very well networked internationally, and they have been proactive in getting the rights that they seek into a number of human rights documents which are influential and being used to create a clash with the rights of women. I call the transgender rights movement a men's sexual rights movement. It was started and is led by men who are transvestites, masochistically sexually excited by imitating women. There is a growing, powerful international men's sexual rights movement that supports the demands of transgender rights activists. It features powerful individual and corporate donors, a range of very influential human rights organizations, many dedicated entirely to trans rights internationally, and a variety of important documents making statements about trans rights that do not yet have any force in international law, but are increasingly being incorporated into law in national jurisdictions. The Declaration is already helping to create a framework internationally for women to resist this form of erosion of our rights and fight back. It originated in the UK as part of a huge wave of outrage that began in 2017 when the UK government proposed to introduce self-identification of gender into the law. The law on what is now called gender identity in the UK consists of the 2004 Gender Recognition Act. Before that act, persons in the UK who wanted to change their sex on identity documents were not able to do so. The 2004 Act happened because a bus driver who called himself Christine Goodwin, a man who had been married and had 4 children, took a case to the European Court on the grounds that he had a right to family life, and it was discriminatory for the UK not to allow him the right to marry as a woman. As a result of that, the UK government, which was found to be at fault, had to introduce legislation. It did not seem happy to do so. There wasn't great enthusiasm, but the legislation came in 2004, and it was considered that it would cover a very few people, maybe 3,000 in the UK. There was no attempt to define gender in the Act, but clearly gender is a euphemism for sex, because it is sex that is changed on the birth certificate and not something called gender. In 2017, the UK government said it was going to make it easier for applicants to change their sex. They wanted to introduce self-identification so that applicants would just have to sign a form saying that they were now the opposite sex, and 3 months later they would be so legally. There were to be no other controls. Feminists in the UK immediately embarked on a campaign of protest. The Gender Recognition Act is manifestly absurd. No one can change sex. Recognising gender in the law was a way of formally accepting what feminists have always seen as the system of sex stereotypes that maintains women's oppression. But at least there were limited numbers of men with certificates who were able to claim that they were women, because they had to have the support of doctors and live in what was called their new sex for 18 months. Self-ID, though, self-identification, is another matter, as it would allow any transvestites who occasionally wore women's knickers the Kiks to be recognized as women in law. Feminists formed groups and they held meetings up and down the country and engaged in many different tactics of opposition. We were successful. That is the exciting thing I am able to tell you today, and why it's very good to be talking to you today. The Times newspaper today has as its front page story the fact that the government has abandoned completely its plans to introduce self-identification, and more than that, it will introduce legislation to ensure that women-only spaces such as prisons are protected, and it will centralise the provision of public toilets so that local councils cannot make them gender neutral, i.e. making them unsafe spaces for women. This victory is huge for us, but it should also be a beacon of hope to feminists in other countries that such success can be achieved, and it should inspire us. The Act does not, the abandonment of the Act does not cover Scotland, because Scotland is able to make separate legislation. So there's still a big battle there to prevent gender self-ID. Now, during these years of struggle in the UK, we realised our struggle had to be international, because in all the proposals for law change, an international document called the Yogyakarta Principles from 2007 was said to be best practice on gender self-ID. The principles, as I shall explain here, incorporated a transvestites charter which demanded self-identification laws. So some of us decided to create our own document which could be used in opposition to the transvestites charter and show how the demands the transvestites were making were in contradiction to the human rights that women had argued for and won over decades. Now, I'll just say a little bit about gender. Gender is, of course, not the same as sex. Sex cannot change and is written into every cell of the human body. Whereas sex is biological, gender, which is socially constructed, consists of sex stereotypes, which set out the qualities that are assigned to women and men under male domination. Sex stereotypes are used to justify women's oppression by saying that our oppression is natural. The ideology of transgenderism says that persons who transgender are essentially endowed with something called a gender identity, which consists of the mental and behavioral characteristics culturally assigned to someone of the opposite sex, such as, for instance, women are expected to enjoy doing the housework, to wear makeup and high-heeled shoes, and so on. Without the idea that there is such a thing as a feminine gender, transgenderism could not exist, because there would be nothing to trans. Transgenderism comes from and represents male domination. And this is what makes the notion of transgender rights an arrow at the heart of women's struggle, and takes us back to the 1950s, when women were seen as a separate category of person who were naturally suited to being an underclass. The stratification of society on the basis of gender creates the scaffolding of our oppression, and feminists seek to abolish gender. Transgenderism, on the other hand, seeks to rehabilitate gender and provide it with rights. Persons who transgender are diagnosed as having, or simply proclaim that they have, something called gender dysphoria, because their gender, whatever that is, and of course it is never defined, does not match their biological sex. The problematic nature of this diagnosis is clear in the fact that heterosexual adult women do not get gender dysphoria, or at least it is extraordinarily rare in such women. If this diagnosis was identifying a genuine condition, then heterosexual women would get it too. In fact, there are no media stories about heterosexual women who create psychological torment for their husbands by saying one day out of the blue that they're really men, running around the house in Y-fronts and demanding to have gay sex with them. This does not happen. But it is the completely common story for the vast majority of men who transition. They're heterosexual men with a sexual fetish for stereotypical women's clothes. The minority of men who transition are homosexual men who do not feel able to love men whilst they have male bodies. The women who transition are overwhelmingly lesbians who do not have a sexual fetish, but may suffer from despair at being in the oppressed and degraded category of womanhood, or feel that if they love women, then they must really be men. The big difference between men and women who transition is that women are trading down for sexual excitement and women are trading up in social status. And quite different social and political explanations are needed to explain this. Men who transgender do not like critical analysis of their transgenderism and where it comes from, because this undermines the essentialness of their condition. They want to be understood as an oppressed category of persons who have mysteriously acquired a female brain in a male body. The legislative and policy gains they have made, which endanger women's rights and threaten to disappear women as biologically female persons, are based upon this essentialist ideology. To support the ideology, they argue that transgender persons have always existed in history. There is little sociological or political analysis as to why the practice of transgenderism has arisen or why it is burgeoning so much and so quickly. Both in universities and in the media and politics, transgenderism is assumed to be a natural condition that has always existed, even though it's such a recent phenomenon. In fact, transgenderism is socially and politically constructed, and the present contagion is a result of forces of power in a heteropatriarchal society, rather than related in any way to an innate and transhistorical condition. Transgender activists may state, for instance, that there have always been transgender children suffering in silence. There have not. There is no evidence that many thousands of children were innately transgender before this idea was created in the last 2 decades. The fact that the ideas and practice of transgendering children are becoming so accepted suggests that it represents a social contagion in which many vulnerable young people are being caught up through social media and promotion by interest groups in schools. As transgenderism grows as a social contagion, the many social harms associated with it increase exponentially, from conflict with women's rights, to the conversion of young lesbians and gay men to surgically constructed heterosexuality, to serious health problems created by treatment, and many others. I'm going to explain how transgenderism was socially constructed in the last few decades. The major force in the construction of transgenderism was the medical profession. Sexologists, the scientists of sex, called men who cross-dressed occasionally cross-dressers or transvestites. The idea that some men, those who wanted to imitate women on a more permanent basis, were a special category of persons called transsexuals, who could actually change their sex, only became thinkable as the result of developments in medicine in the 20th century, such as artificial hormones, cosmetic surgery, and anesthesia. The sexologists were conservative men, the enforcers of male domination, who believed that homosexual men must have some element of femaleness in themselves, that they were not real men. As a result, they first exercised their skills at changing sex on homosexuals. The majority of men who transgender, however, are not gay, but heterosexual. And as I will explain, their behavior is caused by a sexual problem, which the sexologists call autogynephilia, or love of the woman in oneself. Before the 1990s, transvestites or cross-dressers were seen by the sexologists as having a sexual perversion, or paraphilia, which caused them to be sexually excited by wearing what they saw as women's clothes. Most medical professionals today, however, have changed their mind about men's cross-dressing under pressure from a transgender rights movement. They no longer talk about it as a paraphilia, but use the language of gender identity. In order to gain social respectability, cross-dressers need to hide their sexual motivation and pretend that they have had some mysterious but real transformation into women. Some sexologists, though, have never changed their minds. They maintain the understanding that transgenderism is not about an essence of femininity, but sexual. And they use the term autogynephilia to explain this. On the basis of having studied and treated these men and collecting their fantasies and their testimonies, they say that these men seek masochistic sexual excitement by engaging in imitations of women in a variety of ways. One group of autogynephiles is interested only in wearing what they see as women's clothes. Another group likes to engage in what practitioners see as women's activities. Some like to knit, for instance. Another group of autogynephiles seeks to emulate women's biology. These men like to pretend to menstruate by using pads and red ink, or by seeking used tampons in the women's toilets and stuffing them up their bottoms. Others wear rubber female body parts, either just a vulva or a whole bodysuit, in which they will stand in front of a mirror and fondle their rubber breasts, for instance. The most dedicated seek permanent physical alteration by using hormones or having amputations. And these are the ones who would once have called themselves transsexuals. Almost without exception, these men seek to censor any suggestion that they are doing these things for sexual reasons, because that might inhibit the sympathy of the public. Men who transgender are quite likely to have other sexual perversions as well, called co-paraphilias. These may include a clearly related paraphilia called apatemnophilia, or body identity integrity disorder, in which men are excited by the idea of being amputees and may seek to have legs amputated. The co-paraphilias may include nappy fetishism, in which men engage in what they call age regression and may imitate babies in nappies and even demand that their women university lecturers or social workers change their soiled nappies. These male behaviors are written about in the media as fascinating but mysterious, and the sexual motivation which explains them is never mentioned. It should be quite clear that these paraphilias are a male problem. The sexologists recognize that women do not get sexually excited by fetishism in the way that men do. The language that these men use to describe themselves and the sexologists use to describe them changed in the 1990s. There was a shift to using the term gender instead of sex amongst the women's human rights community, unfortunately. And this has enabled the idea of gender identity rights to take hold. It has created great confusion. It has led to the absurd term gender violence, for instance, instead of violence against women. And these ways of using the word gender are very common in the international rights community. Gender violence is a euphemism. It's deliberately not saying who is doing the violence and to whom. Gender equality is another absurdity. Gender represents a hierarchy, and you cannot have hierarchy equality. That is a tautology. The term gender may have been a convenient euphemism in the human rights sphere, where there is great opposition to any work on women, but it has allowed the notion of gender identity to slip into the rights vocabulary without the great skepticism with which it should have been treated. The adoption of the language of gender in the human rights community in the 1990s and after, instead of the word sex, provided an entry point for the men to campaign for their rights to cross-dressing. but there were other forces too involved in enabling this acceptance of gender identity. One was the impact of queer and postmodern theory, which promoted the idea that it was transgressive and progressive for people to cross-dress in the form of drag queens, for instance, or lesbian role-playing. At the same time, the development of the internet provided a way in which the men with this sexual interest could create support and campaigning groups, which began to campaign for the right to what they call gender expression, and adopted the techniques of the successful lesbian and gay rights movement. The development of the pornography industry created a great interest in transvestism among men and has helped in the huge expansion of men who want to express their gender identities in public. At least 10% of the industry serves men who are masochistically attracted to imitating women. I think it has also led to the fact that the vast majority of these men who have gender identities do not want to surgically remove their penises. They want to, of course, retain the sexual excitement that they get from the pornography and from acting out in public. I'm going to talk now about the campaign for transgender rights. The ambition of these cross-dressers for social acceptance was set out in 1995 by some men in the United States, entitled the International Bill of Transgender Rights. It was just a wish list as to how they would like their sexual fantasies to be accommodated and protected by the state. One of the American men was transsexual, and one was a family man and an occasional cross-dresser. The bill had, of course, no standing in law and may have seemed outlandish to many at the time if they had known about it. But these men's demands have now been incorporated in domestic law in many countries and are being campaigned for with considerable success in international fora through the vehicle of the Yogyakarta Principles of 2007, which were updated in 2017. These principles are about sexual orientation and gender identity. To the extent that they demand rights for lesbians and gay men, they are thoroughly useful and they need to be supported. The problem is that they attach the right to gender identity to gay rights. The principles define gender identity as innate, saying gender identity is understood to refer to each person's deeply felt internal and individual experiences of gender. The women's human rights understanding that gender represents sex stereotypes that should be eliminated has been replaced by the idea that each person, i.e. everyone, has a gender. I do not have one, and nor do most of the women I know. Thus, the Yogyakarta Principles are based on a falsehood. The Yogyakarta Principles and all the instruments that arise from them state that gender identity should be self-defined. The principles were not a UN document, but they were influential over the next decade. They swiftly came to be seen to represent best practice in policy terms and were referenced by governments as they brought in legislation to enable men to self-identify as women. There are many ways in which gender identity rights are in contradiction to the rights of women. They threaten the traditional political rights that were the first human rights to be set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights in 1966, such as the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the right to political representation. One of the effects of the transgender rights movement is the suppression of women's and feminist speech. There is no free speech in the UK for anyone who questions the narrative that men can actually become women and should be treated as if they are. At present, the police and the courts are being used to persecute women and some men who point out that men who say they have a female gender identity are in fact biologically male. Friends of mine have received visits from the police to interview them about things they have said online that are critical of transgenderism on the grounds that these may constitute hate speech. When I was still teaching at the University of Melbourne, before I retired back to the UK in 2015, transgender activists tried to stop me teaching in a way that was critical of their practice. I had to have security guards on my lectures and become incognito, taking my name off my office door. Because of the determination of transgender and sex work activists, they very often work together to attack me. Women have lost their jobs for being critical online. Lesbians have been thrown out of bars and pubs for wearing T-shirts with slogans that are offensive to cross-dressers, such as saying that men cannot be lesbians. The right to freedom of assembly is another right that is threatened. Feminist meetings are having to be held in secret with a constant threat that the transgender activists will find out the venue, threaten it with petrol bombs or other disorder to get it cancelled, or protest outside so aggressively that it is impossible to hold the meeting. Women's rights to political association have also come under attack. In Britain, political parties such as the Labour Party have until recently had women's rights, women's shortlists. In other words, they have favoured the selection of women as MPs. Now, of course, men and boys, teenage boys, can be on those shortlists, even though, of course, they are male. And this threatens women's political representation, which is a very, very important part of the Convention on the Elimination of all of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which is the basis of the rights that we talk about in our convention. Safe spaces are another right that is being threatened. Transgender activists threaten what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights calls the right to live in freedom and safety. Men with a female gender identity are demanding and gaining the right to enter spaces set aside to ensure women's safety. These women's spaces include women's toilets and changing rooms, women's prisons, women's shelters. Women's spaces were created to afford women dignity and safety. Increasingly, toilets are being degendered in public places and in schools at the behest of transgender activists so that men are able to harass women in the toilets. This has already led, in some cases, to girls refusing to go to school because they did not want to have to do things such as change tampons whilst boys were in the same toilets. Other women-only spaces that men with gender identities have forced their way into are prisons. Male offenders who claim to have female gender identities, including murderers and rapists, are being placed in women's prisons. There is an increasing rate of reported sexual assaults against the vulnerable women who are forced to live with these men in prisons. Almost half of the women demanding entry to women's prisons are sex offender, compared with only 19% in the general prison population, and this should be a cause for concern. In 2018, a man called Karen White, a paedophile and rapist, sexually assaulted 2 women prisoners in the UK. Male prisoners can rape because the vast majority of transvestites do not seek surgery to remove their penises. They claim to be women with penises. The Convention on Women's Human Rights, CEDAW, establishes women's rights to take part in recreation, sports, and all cultural activities on an equal basis with men. The right to equality in sport has already been removed by the inclusion of men with gender identities in women's sports. And there are many women saying online now that women's sports are over. Another group of people whose rights are under threat, of course, are children, both male and female children. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child says that every child has the right to the best possible health. Unfortunately, one of the demands of the transgender rights movement is that children should be transgendered. There's been a huge increase in the numbers of children being transgendered. In 5 years in the UK, the number of children being presented at the Gender Identity Clinic at the Tavistock increased from 468 to 2,519 a year, a rise of more than 400%. They are mostly girls and almost entirely same-sex attracted, i.e. lesbians, who are being transgendered in support of transgender ideology. The adult male transgender activists promote the transgendering of children because this makes their practice more respectable and less obviously about sexual fetishism. If children do it too, they think, that makes it look more innate. The children at younger and younger ages are put on harmful drugs to delay puberty, which causes delays in brain development, sterilization, loss of bone mass, and likely a catalogue of other harms as yet unknown. When they have body parts amputated at 16 or 18 and are put on hormones, they will suffer many other harmful health effects, such as the inability to have sexual feelings or function, and be dependent on drugs for physical functioning for the rest of their lives. One serious effect of taking testosterone in these young lesbians, for instance, is the fact that orgasm can cause excruciating pain. The effects of transgenderism on lesbians is particularly severe because the practice eliminates lesbianism. Increasing numbers of lesbians, particularly very young lesbians, are being encouraged to believe that they must really be men because they love women. Back when I became a lesbian in the 1970s, it was common to attack lesbians by saying they must really want to be men or actually really were men. Now there is a war on lesbians in which serious violence is carried out against their healthy bodies in order to make them into men. Lesbians who are transgender suffer conversion therapy to make them chemically and surgically constructed heterosexuals with serious harms to their health. There are promising signs that the transgendering of lesbians is being challenged as increasing numbers of young lesbians are detransitioning, i.e. realizing that undergoing drugs and surgery to try to be men was a mistake and coming to accept that they are in fact women and lesbians. And I know this is happening in Sweden too. These young women who are speaking out on social media, on marches and rallies and at public events are very brave. So all of these ways in which women's human rights are being undermined are in contradiction to CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that feminists fought for decades and which was achieved in 1979. That was seen as a huge advance, and none of us could have imagined in the 1980s and 1990s that a war on women's human rights would have been launched on an enormous scale by men who are pretending to be women at this time. The Declaration already is providing a linchpin around which women are organising to protect these rights that in theory they have against the attacks upon them by these men. And we would like individual women and women's organisations to sign on to the Declaration at womensdeclaration.com. Thank you.
As we've seen some progress in Great Britain, especially with J.K. Rowling and with drawback on the self-identification laws, we have not seen the same progress in Sweden. In Sweden, it is still, and in the other Nordic countries, still very much a taboo question to speak about. And I know that a lot of you who are listening right now are active in closed, secret Facebook groups and so on, but I think right now is the time to actually move out in the spotlight. You know, it's time to actually speak up. It's time to affect legislation, because if nobody does that, we're going to see self-ID coming in effect in the Nordic countries, in Sweden too, in Finland too, as it's already on the way. In Norway, it's already been there for a couple of years. We're already seeing the effects of it. So we really need to speak out here. I would like to talk a little bit about the ideology of this new gender ideology, which doesn't really have a name. I find it very difficult to find a name for it. You know, some people call it trans ideology, although I think it's much bigger than that, because the essence of this new type of ideology is not about trans people. It is about women and men, and particularly about women. This ideology, I would like to say, has 3 layers. When we first meet it, the first layer is a story about tolerance, about being open, about understanding diversity, about seeing that, you know, gender is more complex than just binary. There's a lot of talk about moving beyond the binary, that, you know, there's many genders. Even Facebook says there's 72 genders. You can identify the way you personally feel. Nobody but you knows what gender you are, and so on. So essentially, we're hearing a story that's very similar, or draws upon gay rights movement, but also to a certain extent the feminist movement. You know, there is a lot of phrases borrowed or stolen from the feminist movement here, like break gender and, you know, smash and revolt and things like that, that makes us think that, you know, oh, we're like heading towards a world where, you know, there is no oppression, there is no patriarchy, which might make us think, hey, this is utopia, or at least it sounds somewhat like it. And this story also has like a central person, like a central protagonist, which is said to be the trans or the non-binary person. So when we hear the story, we think that this is about an oppressed group that is supposed to make changes in the world, just like workers, women, Black people, sexual people did, and so on. So now is the time for transgender people. So at this stage, you know, a lot of people can buy into the story. You know, this story doesn't sound bad at all. It sounds like, okay, why not? You know, there's nothing wrong with this. When we get to the second layer, however, a lot of things change. All of a sudden, this talk about diversity and about many genders is gone. All of a sudden, we're seeing that there is only two genders. There is male and female, and if you're not one, you are the other, and you have to decide which one you are. So when we read books, for example, children's books like I Am Jazz, I suppose a lot of you heard about Jazz Jennings, who at 7 years of age founded her own foundation, trans foundation in the States, and has become kind of like the poster girl for the transing of children. If you read this book, I Am Jazz, what you see is a person, a little girl, saying, I love pink, I love mermaids, but there's just, and I love playing with girls, but there's just one thing that's different about me, and it's that I was born a boy. But because I love pink, and because I love mermaids, I am a girl. So really here, what we're not seeing is breaking gender roles. What we're not seeing is moving beyond the binary. What we're seeing is an extreme binary, but not of sex, but of gender. So what is said here is that gender has become the defining principle of what sex is. So if back in the days that said that there was sex, which was biological, material, tangible, realistic, that was just there, then there was gender, which was stereotypes, roles, an effect of patriarchy, but that was something that you used to call a social construction. Now all this has been reversed. So what we hear now is that the real, the material, what exists is gender, the role. That is what gender really is, what sex really is, whereas biological, material sex is supposed to be a social construction. So that's what we have terms like assigned sex or assigned gender, as if what doctors did when they saw a baby being born was just hand out genders, like, you know, at random, as if it was an observed sex. But now we're hearing that sex is a social construction, but whereas gender is real. Gender in this story appears like something like an essence. The real truth of the inner self is what gender the person is. And again here, we're seeing terms borrowed from the feminist movement, terms like social construction, which makes a lot of people who are not paying attention to the story kind of just buy it without reflecting on the fact that, you know, we have completely switched, which means essentially that states are now to define sex as gender roles. So gender roles are becoming the foundation of what is sex, basically. When we're seeing other books, for example, directed to parents of trans children, these books are very, very, very conservative, even more conservative than conservative ever was. Because what we're told there is that you have to really watch your 3-year-old. If your 3-year-old boy, for example, when he's about to take off his pajamas, he puts it on his head and says, look, I got long hair. I got long hair. He's actually a girl. And you need to take him to the clinic. He needs to be put on hormones and so on. The transing of children has a background in what's called the Dutch Protocol, in which Dutch doctors and the endocrinologists discovered that it was way easier to turn a boy into a woman and a girl into a man than turning women into men and men into women. Because if they had never reached puberty, then it was easier to achieve a body that could be passing in society. So I'm not going to get into all that now, but there's lots of research on how much the medical establishment and certain clinics, certain companies, certain pharmaceutical companies have invested in the transgender children. And a lot of the same people are involved in the funding of research about the effects of transgender children. So it's like goes around everything. I mean, the same people who are funding the research are actually carrying out surgery and hormone treatments, are paying for chairs at universities like trans studies, where it's of course found that these treatments are great and have no side effects and so on. So there's really, just when you get into it, you're surprised at how few people are actually involved in this. And the same names keep on reappearing in every text or every piece of research. So there's really about like maximum 100 people in the world who have been involved in furthering the idea that kids should be transgender and should be put on hormones like the earliest possible and so on. The interesting thing though, however, when we get to the third layer, is if in the first layer we were told that this was about diversity, about being open, about breaking binaries, and in the second layer we're told that this is about you either or, you're pink or blue, you're either girl or boy. And I also have to add that there is a whole growing body of research by especially neurologists that are trying to prove that gender roles are biological. So the funny thing here is that they're no longer trying to prove, as they were back in the 80s, that women have a female brain and that women are inherently interested in knitting, whereas men have a male brain and they're inherently interested in cars. If anybody is born liking cars, they are a man. And if anybody is born liking to knit or having a preference for the color pink, they are female. Which of course is a theory that will prove itself, because then even if half of women or 10% of women are born or just develop an interest in cars, then you can say, well, you're actually male. So the theory kind of proves itself. But this body of research is also trying to prove an essentially binary theory that you are either feminine or masculine, and that this is just something that you are, right? But the interesting thing is that when we come to the third layer, we come to a layer that essentially doesn't have to do with trans people, but rather is a theory about the cis person. Now, who is that cis person? Cis person is said to be the opposite of the trans person. Cis person is a person who's not trans. Now, funnily enough, this word is almost exclusively used about women. So we hear a lot about cis women. We don't hear that much about cis men. Now, I've tried Googling the term cisgender male, cisgender female, and so on, and you get a lot of results for cisgender female. You don't get that many results for cisgender male. So there is a new word here to describe women. Now, as it has been claimed that men can now be women and that anybody can be women and so on, there is still a word to be used for that same group that used to be called women, namely people who biologically are born with two X chromosomes. And that new word is cisgender women. Now, this word has quite a different connotation. Whereas the word women had a connotation to an identity as an oppressed group in patriarchy, and that had a voice, a legitimate voice to change things. The word cisgender female, cisgender woman doesn't really have the same connotation. Cisgender female is used to denote privilege, and that is the most common adjective that is used about this new type of character. She's privileged, and of course, because she's privileged, she's not trans, her role is to stand back and to shut up, even in her own women's movement. So this means that magically our group, half the population, has been renamed. And from being an oppressed group, we are now a privileged group that should shut up and stand back because trans women are so much more oppressed and we need to leave space for them. This is happening even in places like the Women's March, where women were told not to wear the famous pussy hats because that could disturb trans people. It is happening in universities all over the States where the vagina monologues can no longer be played. Instead, they are called the blank monologues because the word vagina is offensive to trans people. Funny, this is never happening with penises. I mean, we never hear that we should not talk about them because this is offensive to trans people and this is a cisgender organ. But we're hearing it exclusively about women, that women need to stand back, shut up, not talk about their bodies, not talk about their periods, or fragmenting the identity of women into menstruators, into uterus carriers, into vagina havers and whatnot. So essentially, we are, instead of becoming a situation, as Simone de Beauvoir would have it, we are now a kind of collection of body parts that are just lying around without any connection to one another. Now, the interesting thing is the last and deepest layer of the story. We are not hearing a lot about innate gender roles anymore. But the last layer of the story is where we're hearing about laws such as self-identification, whereas any man who wants to be a woman is naturally a woman. And this is where we're having conflicts such as about shelters, about prisons, about sports, about all these places. About sports and about all these places where men are now supposed to enter. Now, the funny thing is that we had a case in Sweden. This is actually not funny, it's very tragic. It was about a man who slaughtered his ex-girlfriend, a Swedish man who slaughtered his ex-girlfriend, a Thai girl, and cut her up. And of course, he was found and he went to prison. And he now claims he is a woman. It's a man called Christopher Johansson. He now claims he is a woman. And as far as I know, he's not had surgery or anything. And he has now been moved to a female prison because he declares he is a woman. Now, according to what was said in the second layer about gender roles are innate, women are pink, men are blue, this man does not qualify as a woman because cutting your girlfriend off, ejaculating on her, is not an especially female thing to do. I mean, no biologist in his right mind would ever say this. Obviously, this is a thing that belongs, no matter what criteria you use, it belongs to the male sex. But in the third layer, we don't hear a lot about gender roles anymore. Now, men decide what they are, and we can't say anything. So all of a sudden, self-identification, which is the final point of this ideology, means a man's right to enter into any territory where he wants to go. Now, do women have the same right? Can all women declare themselves trans men and enter into male prisons, into male changing rooms, into male sports? Well, obviously not, because there is the same old question about strength and violence, which is very tangible and very material. So men defend their territories by strength and violence, whereas women defend our territories by rules, but who can be in there and not be in there. Now, we're told those rules have changed, so we must let anybody in who wants to be there. Whereas, of course, we can't go into the male room because it would be dangerous for us. So what we're seeing here, the last principle of this ideology, is that it is simply a man's right to decide what the woman is, what he is, where he wants to be, and where he can enter. So this, of course, goes against both the first layer of diversity, openness, the breaking of gender. It also goes against the second layer of there are female people and male people and gender roles decide what you are. Because the third layer, it doesn't matter. You have people like also in the north of Sweden, there was a person, a man, who downloaded lots of child pornography. And he was also in the military. He was, I think, something like 2 meters tall. He was in the military. He was also a nationalist and voted for Sweden Democrat Party. So he displayed very typical typically masculine interests, masculine background, masculine occupation. Also, downloading lots of child pornography is not a thing that a lot of women do. Now, he changed gender like after he downloaded all that pornography, but he was still referred to in the media as a woman. So all of a sudden, nobody's caring about gender roles anymore. You know, all of a sudden, nobody's caring about the binary anymore. All of a sudden, man decides what he is, and that's the way it is. So this was very interesting because when this case came out, lots of men on forums on the internet were saying, "Oh, who's this interesting woman? We would like to get to know her." And a lot of other men were saying, "Oh, women are doing this too. Like women are as bad as men." So, meaning that you cannot say that this is a male thing to do, that sexual crime is a male thing because women are doing it just as well. Now, of course, when it came out that it was actually a man, this was something like taboo in the press because you couldn't say it. He had the right to name himself a woman if he wanted to. And this is very interesting. What we're seeing now is a change in statistics and also in media depiction of sexual crime. So we're seeing that, I mean, if he would go to prison, which hasn't been decided yet, it would increase the rate of women being in prison for that type of crime by 5% from only one person, because there are such few women in prison for that type of sexual crime. So this has a tangible effect. Also, according to a lot of parties here in Sweden that want to change how we register gender, we have in Sweden kind of personal number, a personal identification number, which we get when we're born and which also includes what sex we are. So this makes it very easy in Sweden to make statistics on, for example, how much we're paid, when we die, where we live, how much we own, divorce, marriage, like anything, any type of discrimination or any type of statistics are very easy to make just because we have these personal identification numbers that have a digit where it says what sex you are. Now, claiming that non-binary people and trans people are disturbed by this, a lot of political parties now are proposing to take this away entirely and make it gender neutral or sex neutral, basically, which would mean that we would do away with the possibility to make statistics on patriarchy, and that would be, of course, fatal for the women's movement and women's rights in Sweden. And it's very interesting how all these different changes are advocated for, using trans people as a kind of prop, saying, oh, it's because of trans people, but hey, you know, they're only like 0.5% at most in the states of America where this has advanced the most. It's just 0.5% anyway. So the strange thing is that changes that are affecting everybody in the population are being defended, saying that, oh, this is just for the 0.5%, which of course is a group that somebody has mentioned is smaller than the group of Roma people in Sweden. And of course, it would never occur to anyone to make all these far-reaching changes because of Roma people. So, I mean, there's something strange here. We must not buy into the idea that this is all happening because of trans people. No, this is being used as a very intelligent way to counter women's rights, to counter the women's movement, to do away with lots of advances that we have made over the decades. So we must really not be fooled by the trans argument here, because this is a lot bigger. I mean, most of this story, most of this ideology does not even concern trans people at all. Like the question of sports, for example. In the Swedish governmental inquiry about trans people, Transutredningen by Ulrika Westerlund, it was claimed that trans people have worse health and are more passive than others and have bigger rates of obesity and so on. Well, that's fine. Okay, what can we do about that? Well, then the solution proposed was that elite sports at the Olympic level should be open for everyone. Of course, meaning the women's category should be open for everyone. But what does this have to do with some person who's sitting at home being fat and smoking cigarettes on his own couch? I mean, obviously, there's a big difference here between the problem being presented and the solution being presented. So basically what we're talking about here is not solving the problem for a couple of people who have bad health, but changing the way that elite sports are being categorized. And here we have, again, the same pattern that we have two new type of categories being proposed. We have an open female category, and we have a closed male category. So the category of female is open to everyone, in shelters, in sports, in prisons, in rhetoric, in definition, and so on, whereas the category of male stays closed. So this is basically very asymmetric, this new gender model. I would like to encourage everyone here who is watching this to actually stand up and talk, because we need you.